In today's video, you're going to see a Switch running Android, a Switch running Linux, a Switch running some benchmarks and some mobile games, a Switch running PS2 and PS Vita titles, and a Switch running Steam and PC games, even God of War. I mean, the 2018 PS4 title natively handled by Nintendo Switch. How crazy is that? Wondering how all those things works? Keep watching and there's a lot of fun we're gonna show you today. Nintendo Switch is a pretty interesting character. It might not have tons of performance as a console, but it remains to be one of the most tweakable, modify-friendly console on my list. Not only does it have a superb homebrew community, allows you to do game modding, overclocking, and other tricks in Horizon OS, which is the OG system from Nintendo, but it also has this ability to flash other OS according to your flavor, including Android. The whole OS swapping thing is called the Switch Root project. They recently released an update to Android 11 supporting all Switch models, including the newer Lite and OLED models. But bear in mind, it's not like you can just grab a random Switch and do the tricks. You need to be explodable or hard-modded in order to try anything. Thankfully, there's tons of YouTube videos about Switch modding, and as I said before, the community is strong. And it's pretty easy to find everything you need, including the most essential part, the bootloader. Picard. I mean, bootloader is the thing before we boot into OS. This is where we tweak a lot of things, including disk partition, so we obviously have to get it done first. And from here, it's actually pretty easy to install Android. Just download the image file and follow the tutorial on the Switch Root website. Picard includes this Install Android button, which makes things much easier. And since we want to modify stuff and tweak around, I also flashed TWRP, the third-party recovery, and Flash Magisk to gain root access of our Android OS. Okay then, the Android 11 is up and running on the Switch now. It certainly feels pretty smooth, just like any modern tablet you would imagine. And thanks to the unique form factor of Switch, it not only works like a tablet, but if you're quirky like me, you can even attach a keyboard and turns it into a laptop. Can I call that a Surface OLED? Kind of. Well, never mind, I'm just having fun with it. But simple flashing is not enough. We want to push the boundary a bit further because Nintendo Switch is definitely not the nicest dude when it comes to performance. If we want to unleash all the potential of it on Android, overclocking is a must. We can find the config files for Android right here under bootloader folder, and all we need to do is add some commands here for OC. By doing so, my OLED model can push the CPU to run as high as 2.3 GHz and the GPU up to 1267 MHz. As a comparison, the OG Nintendo setting operates the Tegra X1 CPU at only 1 GHz and the GPU runs at 768 for docked and only 460 for handheld mode. So clearly we're quite aggressive here, but no need to be worried because first, Switch has an active cooling, and second, we're not actually overclocking this thing, but rather bringing it back to its original form. Because it seems like the exact same chip in Shield TV also operates way more aggressive than the Switch spec. So I think it's just Nintendo being too conservative. But our OC journey is not stopping here. We can also overclock the RAM. The default 1600 MHz RAM only provides about 26 gigs per second of bandwidth. Remember, Switch is using a Tegra chip, which is an SoC with integrated graphics, so even a small increase in memory speed can make a huge difference in graphics performance. Let's add a RAMOC command here and overclock this thing to 2133 MHz, which is the max number you can get under Android. And I think after all these tweaking around, it's time to put it to the test. We did run some benchmarks to see how Nintendo Switch performs against modern smartphones. The sad news is, the CPU part of this Tegra X1 chip seems extremely bad. For Nintendo's original 1 GHz spec, what we got here is a multi-core performance even worse than a single-core performance of a Snapdragon 4 Gen 1, a single core of today's low-end smartphone chip. That just shows you how bad the CPU really is. After all, it's already an 8-year-old product, and it is basically just 4 outdated A57 cores running at a 20th century clock speed. Fortunately, we did try overclocking here and it just performs way better. At 2.3 GHz, this Tegra X1 CPU almost doubled the performance, nearly on par with the Snapdragon 821. Maybe not the most modern pace, but still acceptable considering where it came from. The GPU, on the other hand, is quite impressive for an 80-year-old veteran. If we stick with the OG handheld spec, this GPU is quite close to a Snapdragon 845. Under dark mode, it gets close to an 855. And if we overclock the GPU alone to 1267, it would be better than an 855. Combine that with an overclocked RAM, we got ourselves a graphic performance close to a Snapdragon 865. Bear in mind, Tegra X1 is a 2015 chip, while maybe questionable since this is a 16nm revision, not the OG 20nm one, but you get it. I just feel pretty good when veteran ages well. And it also shows you how the bottleneck of Switch is usually the memory bandwidth. The GPU runs 10% faster by just overclocking RAM. That is quite unusual to see. Considering its ancient CPU performance and quite limited bandwidth, I just want to take a moment to appreciate all the real heroes, game developers on Switch, especially those cross-platform third-party games. I just couldn't imagine how challenging it is to port those PC and console AAA titles to Switch. Definitely did some crazy works. Alright, since we have Android installed, maybe we can try some weird things that the Switch can only dream of, like playing mobile games. We tried Genshin Impact on Switch. It kind of works. I mean, we do get into the game, but it's definitely not working well. Just look at those janks and stutters. You can't even take a break with those frame drops. The GPU actually have enough power to run over 30 FPS, like here when we stop moving, but those stutters from an overload CPU is just unbearable. That is also why lowering down the graphics settings won't really help the frame rate. The interesting thing is, Genshin Impact actually announced a Switch version back then when it first launched. They even dropped the trailer on YouTube, but they never released the game. And I kinda see why here. Tons of works have to be done before it can really take shape. And the GPU-favored Switch hardware is just not suitable for a CPU-bound game like Genshin Impact. We tried another mobile title, Honkai Star Rail. Normally for a smartphone, this game is even more demanding than Genshin Impact, but it actually runs way better on Switch. We're getting 30 to 40 FPS under medium setting, even in some most demanding things. And the lowering graphic settings actually works, getting us over 50 FPS, because this is typically a GPU-bound game, which really suits the Switch hardware. If you think playing mobile games on Switch isn't crazy enough, well, no need to rush. We're just getting started. Let's try PlayStation 2 emulation on Switch. How about this? Playing Gran Turismo 4 on Switch! Well, not exactly playing because the CPU of Switch is still a bit weak to handle such a demanding PS2 title at full speed. Still, this is already the pinnacle of PS2, so Switch should be fine with those less demanding games. Another interesting emulator we tried is Vita 3K, a PS Vita emulator. Fascinating, right? I never thought about it before trying, but I have to say, playing Vita games on Switch doesn't feel weird at all. They do have pretty similar form factor. However, the Vita 3K emulator is still in its early age of development, and you won't see those graphic issues and bugs in larger games. I definitely won't consider that playable for now, but still, the performance seems quite decent, showing us some real promise. Speaking of which, Yuzu has also released an Android version, so we got this weird question of, can Switch emulate Switch? I've been itching to try this for a while. Unfortunately, Yuzu's GPU compatibility on Android isn't up to scratch. At least it's not working with this Tegra X1 NIT. Well, that is not surprising because You know, emulating Switch on the Switch, no one sees that coming, huh? And you know what? We're not stopping here yet. I got another interesting game to show you, which is Half-Life 2.
Rise and shine, Mr. Freeman. Rise and shine.
A couple years ago, Nvidia has ported several PC games to Android for the Tegra platform, serving their Shield products. These games are Nvidia exclusives on Android. While majority of them actually received a Switch port, a few of them didn't. That includes Half-Life 2. We got into the game pretty easily, and it runs surprisingly smooth. Since the game allows you to reassign controller layout, the joystick works just fine here. Performance-wise, it mostly keeps 60 frames per second with frame drops in complex scenes. That is actually quite decent gaming experience. And I just hope Half-Life 2 can find its way to an official release on Switch. I think it's totally viable. While Android on Switch does provide us some entertainment here, the main course is yet to come. Let me introduce Linux on Switch. This is even more exciting than Android. We can flash the L4T Ubuntu onto the Switch. And then through days of relentless tinkering, we can even run PC games, AAA PC games, on Switch. Sounds impressive, right? But how can a Switch, a Linux device with an ARM chip, run Windows PC games? That doesn't make any sense. Well, the secret lies in a few essential tools we're used here. Wine, Box64, and DXVK. If you're a Linux enthusiast, you must be familiar with Wine. It's a translation layer that allows you to call Windows API on Linux and macOS. Both the Proton on Steam Deck and the recently released game porting toolkit for macOS are kind of based on Wine. Simply speaking, Wine is here to help us building a Windows-like environment. Another teammate is Box64, a very interesting tool that translates x86 instructions for ARM, with a 32-bit version called Box86. You might think this translation can be bad for performance, but Box86 and Box64 have developed to be highly efficient over the years, allowing us to run x86 applications smoothly on ARM platform. And the final piece of puzzle is DXVK, which, as the name implies, translates DirectX graphic interface into Vulkan, enabling us to run these games under Linux. Actually, Steam Deck uses DXVK as well, and that definitely looks pretty decent with very little performance loss. However, using all these translation layers together feels a bit outlaw, and I'm not surprised if anyone gets concerning here. Let's just start tinkering and see. Honestly, this tinkering process is quite tricky. Installing Linux is easy enough, with detailed steps provided on Switchroot website. Like Android, once you partition the SD card and copy the files, just one-clicking Hicot is all you need. And after a quick setup, we now have this L4T-based Ubuntu 18.04 system on our Switch. To make things easier, I plug in a keyboard and mouse into the Switch, which looks a bit quirky. Never mind. The first thing I'm gonna do here is still overclocking. That is what the channel is all about, right? Again, just modify the config file like we did for Android. And the good news is, there's no limit for RAM overclocking under Linux, unlike previously on Android. We can even increase the memory voltage for further overclocking. My Switch can go up to 2500 MHz, which significantly improves performance. After that, I installed JSON stats to monitor our hardware. I can use the JTAP command to bring it up. It's kind of like a task manager. In the Linux, we've already turned on the high performance mode here, and by another command called JSON clocks, we can force the Tegra chip to work at its highest clock speed and maxing out the fan. So as you can see, it now locked the CPU to the maximum 2.3 GHz, GPU over 1200 MHz, and the RAM goes up to 2500 MHz. I've already did some stress tests to see if it works, just in case it crashes into eternity. I have to say, tweaking with performance is actually the easiest part, because now we're gonna go through the tough stuff, the deployment process. first, we need to deploy Box64 and Wine under Linux. Set up Wine a bit, and with these two in place, we can already run Windows software. Let's try to run Cinebench R15, a CPU rendering benchmark to see how this CPU performs under translation. Well, the rendering experience is quite painful to say the least. Definitely keeps us waiting for a while. And finally, we got a multi-core score of 83. To give you some clues, this double-digit result is even worse than some 10 years old Chromebook. The A57 is weak to begin with, and adding translation layers on that, it's no surprise it can't perform well. To be honest, with such minimal CPU performance, I'm kind of worried about the upcoming gaming stuff. So now we got the Box64 and Wine, the last thing we need for gaming is DXVK. But before that, I need to upgrade the Jetpack, which is NVIDIA's driver on this Switch. The L40OS from Switch Root Project only supports driver version 32.3 by default, which only allows us to use Vulkan 1.1. Makes it impossible to run a lot of PC games. In theory, Tegra X1 can upgrade to 32.7 driver, enabling Vulkan 1.2. But due to numerous bugs and performance issues with this version, the devs of Switch Root decided to disable this upgrade in the preference file. Since upgrading to Vulkan 1.2 is critical for DXVK, it kinda leaves us no choice but to join the rebellion and break the seal. And after upgrading the NVIDIA driver, we finally have Vulkan 1.2 support, and now we can install DXVK. However, we still can't use the latest 2.2 version as it requires Vulkan 1.3 support, which we can never get on Tegra X1. So we're gonna use an older version here. After that, we still need to use a tool called Wine Tricks to configure the runtime environment for Wine. As we all know, gaming on Windows inevitably involves dependencies. I mean, remember those DLL files, right? Running games with Wine also requires these things. And after that, the last thing we need to do is increase the virtual RAM, or let's say swap file, on Linux. Nintendo Switch only has 4 gigs of RAM, which is not nearly enough for PC games. To at least get the bigger games to run, we have to allocate more than 8 gigs of swap file like I'm doing here. Fun fact, new games might perform better than the old ones on this Linux Switch because the Linux for Tegra X1 doesn't support 32-bit drivers. It's a pure 64-bit platform. We can directly access the GPU under Box64 running 64-bit games, but for older 32-bit games, we must use Box86, which has to take a runabout with Mesa and VirGL solutions, making our days much harder. But anyway, I still installed Box86 here for Steam, and I must admit it's a lot more complicated than installing Box64. You have to set up an isolated environment and install it using Shroot, and I think you might not want to get into that for sure. Finally go through all the shits on Linux. It definitely doesn't sound easy, but if you want to see the glory, you're gonna pay the price. Now it's time to enjoy everything. So first, let's try to run Steam, and it actually runs! Wow! We've successfully run Steam client on Nintendo Switch! We can even enter the big picture mode, and look at that! A Nintendo Steam Deck! Never thought about it, right? How crazy is that? Apart from the pretty mind-blowing idea, we do have some real problems. As you can see, Steam consumes a lot of resource in the background, making games quite unplayable with Steam running. So we have to compromise, try not to use Steam as much as possible. The first game we're gonna try here, maybe we should start with a relatively easy one like Titanfall 2. Well, saying it's easy is still pretty, exaggerated. It's a proper PC AAA title. And for the poor CPU of the Switch, I will say it's just a miracle to run any games at all. Let's see if Titanfall 2 works on Switch. Well, not a bad start. It indeed loads into the game. Wow, this main menu is pretty smooth, and it seems it might actually works. Alright, loading is incredibly slow, and we have to wait like a century. But eventually, hard work pays off, and we enter the game. Hey, it seems pretty okay. We got this 30-ish FPS at 720p medium quality. Not bad. Okay, that was just the opening scene. In actual gameplay, it's not that good. You know, the frame rate drops occasionally, but most of the time it's over 20 FPS. Kinda playable. Unfortunately, this game has audio issues, making the sound a bit choppy. But hey, if you mute the audio, it does sort of works. I mean, frame rate feels fine considering everything. At least I can play through the campaign, so mission accomplished, right? I gotta say, with a not so powerful hardware and so many translation layers involved, this performance is already beyond my expectation. And it's time to upgrade the challenge. Let's try something even bigger, like Grand Theft Auto 5. Wow, running GTA 5 on Switch! That's pretty wild, right? And you know what? It actually works! 720p normal setting, the Switch is now running GTA 5. Although the frame rate is nowhere close to the Titanfall 2 level. We can only get a double digit, even single digit here, and we'll consider this unplayable. But I do understand. Such a huge open world game like GTA 5 is just too much for the CPU. It's infamously taxing harsh on I/O. The fact that we can even get into the game is already quite fascinating. While GTA 5 seems quite hard to swallow, we can definitely try other PC games with, let's say, more healthy appetite. For example, Devil May Cry 5. This is another modern AAA game developed by Capcom using the RE engine. It is known for stunning graphics and friendly to many PC hardwares. But what about Switch? Let's find the answer just now. And we successfully enter the main menu. It looks pretty hopeful, quite smooth. And I'll set the graphic to 720p low quality and start the game. I gotta tell you, the cutscene looks really decent, reaching 20-ish FPS. When we actually controlling the character, it runs around maybe 15-ish. Well, not the worst performance you would imagine. Although the frame rate isn't quite enough, it does feel consistent, unlike GTA 5. And the funny thing is, the game kind of runs like a bullet time enabled, so it is sort of playable, just in a very slow way. Considering the caliber of the game, it's still amazing to see it works. But hey, remember we are running at 720p, right? I kinda wonder if it's possible to make it smoother by cutting down the resolution. And it seems impossible. 50% pixels, same frame rate. For me, this is expected because if you look at the JTOP here, you can see the quad-core A57 CPUs are almost exploding. It's a massive CPU bottleneck here, so no matter how much you drop the graphics settings, you just can't break through the limit. Personally, I think with some decent optimizations here and there, it is possible to bring a DMC5 port to Switch. Alright, looks like it's time to try the ultimate challenge, God of War. A Sony franchise PlayStation 4 title on Switch. That is some weird feeling, huh? As you can see, the Sony intro pops out. It's definitely a good sign. And it is trying very hard to load, and load, and load, and we did it! We're in the game now! Holy crap, we're running God of War on a Switch now! Unbelievable! Although the frame rate we got doesn't seem very healthy, but anyway, it does run without graphic issues. Let's look at the setting here. 720p, 50% rendering scale? Really? This is a Nintendo Steam Deck, boy! Come on, put it up! We're not afraid of extra pixels, right? You see that? It's still the same frame rate. Well, let's play through a bit. I must admit, the graphics is just stunning here. Definitely the PS4 level you would expect. Uh-oh, the frame pace is pretty bad. You can really feel the stutters every few seconds, and which is as expected, I would say. But it's definitely running. Just look at me now, operating Kratos. That is not something usual to see on the Nintendo Switch, huh? Even though we're getting less than 10 FPS, the fact that we can even run God of War on the Switch is already something, I would say. And after tons of times we spent on making things work on Linux, it is just so satisfying to see the game actually running. And since we are using Linux, not only can you run some AAA titles on Switch, but you can basically run anything. Like if you want to play things you won't even imagine on Switch, like 3D Pinball or Minesweeper, you can do it. Or if you want to try those not suitable for Nintendo, well, you're free to do that too. I mean, you're on Linux, so you're the god. Well, today we definitely came from a long way behind, and my Switch, I can assure you, he's now the happy kid after traveling around the world. So, what's the point? It's not like a super easy thing to do, and if I want to play PC games, I can just play on PC. Why bother doing that on the Nintendo Switch? Well, I honestly don't know, and I probably won't really choose to play those games here. But the thing is, I do receive a lot of fun. Not the fun of gaming, but the fun of breaking the rules, the fun of doing impossible. For enthusiasts like me, the joy from tweaking hardware and software, the joy from modding, the joy from seeing God of War running on the Switch is never less satisfying than beating the game itself. So if you're watching and getting interested in those things, just feel free to join the venture. Not particularly about Switch, but anything you have an interest in. Just have fun, tweak around with it. After all, being a tech nerd is all about having fun. Thanks for watching, and if you like this video, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel. I'm your fellow Faye, this is Geeker1, and see you next time.